Peter Tobin has been convicted of his third murder and is now officially a serial killer. But the police and people who knew him well suspect he may have killed many times before. So how many victims were there? And could he be Britain's worst serial killer? The disappearance of 18-year-old Dinah McNichol in August 1991 baffled police for 16 years. It was a mystery that was only solved when her remains were found buried in the garden of a Margate house that once belonged to the convicted murderer, Peter Tobin. With Tobin behind bars, Dinah's family can perhaps find peace. But she may never have been found had it not been for another of Tobin's crimes. The murder of Angelika Kluk was so callous and so brutal, it shocked the country. As police investigated Angelika's murder in 2006, they quickly realised that it wasn't carried out by a first-time murderer.
The cool, calculated way that he remained there and covered up his tracks indicated to us that Tobin has committed something similar in the past.
The police knew that if they were going to discover how many other murders Tobin had committed, then they would have to analyse every aspect of his mysterious past. So they set up a unique, secret investigation team called Operation Anagram.
Basically what we're doing is we are looking at the life of Peter Tobin, we're breaking it down, we're dissecting it, we're looking at where he's been. We then look at an event or a missing person. This is the nerve centre. This is where the information, the life of Peter Tobin is held.
Operation Anagram involves every police force in the UK. Linking his nomadic life with unsolved crimes, could Anagram reveal him to be Britain's worst serial killer? It all started for police at this church in Glasgow on September the 24th, 2006. For many, a church is a place of peace and tranquility. It certainly was for Angelika Kluk. The young Polish student was living and working in St Patrick's over her summer holidays. No doubt in such surroundings she felt safe. No one could touch her inside the church. No one with any conscience. But a 60-year-old man going by the false name of Pat McLaughlin was different, and his depravity was to shock even the toughest.
It's one of the most horrific murders that I have ever seen in my 32 years in the police. It was horrendous, and I couldn't visualise how someone could have committed such an act against such an innocent, attractive young female.
It's definitely one of the worst cases I've dealt with, one of the most brutal.
In 2006, Peter Tobin was going by the name of Pat McLaughlin. Using this alias, he became a trusted member of St Patrick's Church. He started by helping a charity, Loaves and Fishes. They use the church to feed the homeless.
I met a Pat McLaughlin. He came one night and it was thunder and lightning and extremely bad weather. He gives a hand to carry things in. Very quiet person. He was very helpful. No reason whatsoever to believe any otherwise.
Serial killers are usually those people who blend in to our society, are able to ingratiate themselves to be quintessentially the nice man who lives next door or who takes our kids to the swimming pool.
McLaughlin eased his way into the job of handyman at St Patrick's. He was trusted with everything. When Angelika Kluk started her summer job at the church, she tragically caught his eye. It wasn't long before the vulnerable young student was taken in by his charms. Then, on Sunday, September the 24th, 2006, he took his opportunity to strike. Tobin hit her with a table leg, knocking her to the ground. He then bound, gagged, raped, and stabbed her. After he had finished with Angelika, he wrapped her body in plastic bags, took her from the murder scene in the garage, and slid her into a small void under the church floor. He then went back to his business, preparing for the Loaves and Fishes Sunday supper.
That body, that young girl was underneath us. And he was there. He didn't disappear. He was there. He was with us.
The next day, Angelika was reported missing to Strathclyde police. They searched the church and its grounds. They interviewed a calm and controlled McLaughlin, who had spent the day erecting a shed in the church grounds, even though traces of Angelika's blood were spattered on the shed.
Well, I met him on Monday night and he was okay. Neither up nor down. Just the way he's always been. When I dropped him off, he'd mentioned, the police are coming, a wee lassie's disappeared. And that was it. That was it. There was no fear, there was nothing.
By Tuesday, Angelica still hadn't been found, and McLaughlin didn't turn up at the church. Strathclyde Police launched a nationwide media appeal with the help of Dennis Curran.
I gave them a photograph, 2 weeks old. It went nationwide at 6 o'clock at night.
Police looking for a missing Polish student have released a photo of the man who's the last person to see her before her disappearance. Pat McLaughlin, who's in his late 50s, saw 23-year-old Angelica Klook on Sunday.
The publicity worked. A young woman recognised the face, but not the name.
When this picture came up in the news, I was like, that's not Pat McLaughlin, that's Peter Tobin. I never waited until the rest of the programme was over. I just went straight to the phone, phoned Mill Street Police Station, informed them that the name was wrong. The face is right, but the name was wrong.
He left the church and he went to Edinburgh, and then he travelled down south and checked into a hospital in London in a false name.
He had signed himself in as James Kelly.
One of the nursing staff recognised the person that had booked in a false name, recognised him as the Peter Tobin that was wanted for interview in relation to the murder of Angelica Klook.
At 9 p.m. on the Friday, Angelica's body had finally been discovered by police, hidden in the small void underneath the floor of the church.
I could see her legs, the lower part of her body, and I could see her hands. And her hands were very clearly blood-stained. There was a lot of blood on her hands. And also her trousers were unfastened, so these two things made me want to go down into the hatch and not move the body. My feeling very strongly was that we had to examine the body in situ. It was a brutal murder, and there's no getting away from that. It was horrible to see. And she'd been stabbed several times, that was apparent from the examination. She'd been bound and she'd been gagged, and the semen on the pants also just confirmed that the sexual intercourse had occurred close to the time of death. By the Monday morning, we had a DNA profile from the semen on the swabs taken from Angelica's body, and these were loaded onto the national database, and we received notification that morning that they matched against a male called Peter Tobin.
Tobin was brought back to Glasgow for questioning, but he denied everything. If the police were to discover anything about him, they would have to do it themselves.
The difficulty about dealing with somebody like Peter Tobin is he's an iterant, a geographically mobile serial offender. In other words, he crosses from one police force boundary area into another.
To date, in the whole of his life, we have established that he probably has used as many as 40 different aliases. And that's combinations of his own names, other people's names, people that he knew. This individual had access to in excess of 30 mobile phones within a year, within 2005, 2006. This was an individual that had something to hide.
To find out how many vicious crimes he was hiding, Operation Anagram began its investigation by going back to the very start of Tobin's long, dark life. They soon discovered he was born on the 27th of August 1946 and spent his early years in Johnston and Renfrew. He was sent to approved school and before the age of 20 had been to Borstal and young offenders institutions for petty crime and forgery.
We've got some clues in relation to how he's going to develop as an adult. He has a very poor relationship with his parents. He moves around constantly. He's supposedly in an approved school from the age of 7. This creates, in the making, a very, very difficult antisocial personality.
Operation Anagram started to build a profile of Tobin. They had discovered through their investigations that he was a loner, but also a charmer, especially of vulnerable young women. What Anagram needed to do was to find out exactly when he began to use his charm to lure victims and satisfy his murderous instincts. In 2006, the secret investigation team dedicated to examining the life of convicted murderer Peter Tobin began looking at his early years. Operation Anagram soon discovered that by the age of 20, Tobin had survived spells in some of Scotland's toughest prisons. But by 1968, he was out of prison and living in a flat in the Shettleston area of Glasgow. He was a good dresser and enjoyed going out in the city's dance halls. In one of them, he asked an attractive 17-year-old called Margaret for a dance.
He came across as a very smart, a very knowledgeable, quite handsome guy. I don't think anybody would have turned him down as a dance partner. So yes, I was quite delighted when he came across him and his pal asked myself and my pal to have a dance. Used to pick me up every Saturday night, used to have me home dead on 10:30 when my parents would ask me to be home then.
When the Operation Anagram detectives interviewed Margaret, they learned that for the first few months, she and Tobin's relationship was a good one. They'd go out dancing and enjoy rides in his car. But behind closed doors, he quietly sapped her confidence and broke down her self-esteem, until one day, back at his flat, he decided to show his other, darker side.
He asked me if I would like to stay over, and I said, well, not this time, I need to ask my mum. I went to open the door and he just slammed the door and said, no, you're not going out.
Tobin had switched. He turned his flat into Margaret's prison. He was her jailer. She wasn't allowed any friends. He wouldn't let her see her parents. He kept her locked up to satisfy his depraved demands.
He wanted sex. I didn't feel in the mood for sex. So he just said, you're effing having sex. And pushed me on the bed. And he just took out the serrated knife and just put it right inside me and twisted it round. After he'd had the sex.
As far as Operation Anagram's investigation of Tobin goes, this attack in 1969 is the first sign of his brutality. He had left Margaret to bleed to death. Her life was saved by a neighbour who found her and called an ambulance. The vicious assault left Margaret in a coma for 3 weeks. While she was fighting for her life, Tobin had told everyone a pack of lies.
Because of what happened on the bed with the knife, I couldn't have children. I'm an absolute total jigsaw inside.
Not only had Tobin taken away Margaret's chance of having children, he had completely destroyed her psychologically. She was discharged from hospital back into the hands of Tobin, too frightened to tell people that he had raped and attempted to murder her. Her nightmare continued as Tobin took her to live in Brighton, hundreds of miles away from friends and family. When Tobin told the 17-year-old they were getting married, she felt there was no way out.
We eventually got a flat in Brighton, and every time he would go out, he would lock me in a room.
Margaret and Tobin stayed in Brighton until he was yet again arrested for petty theft. They were taken back to Glasgow for questioning and spent the night in the cells.
And eventually it was my mother that came and took me out, and that was the first time I'd seen my mother in just under a year. That's how I got away from him.
Margaret spent the next 3 years completely traumatised. In 1971, she divorced Tobin and hoped he was out of her life forever. After 2 more stints in prison, Tobin was on the prowl again in Brighton. In 1973, he married a nurse in the town. They had 2 young children, one of whom died soon after birth. And the violent, abusive marriage lasted just 3 years. By the age of 30, Tobin had 2 failed marriages and a string of ex-girlfriends.
He needs multiple partners because he's ultimately going to have a parasitic lifestyle. He's going to live off those partners. However, he has to attract those people. He has to seduce them. He can't bludgeon them into a relationship.
Working for a living never really appealed to Tobin. His stock in trade was petty crime and forgery, as well as targeting vulnerable young women. One was Kathy Wilson, who was brought up by her grandparents and in foster homes. When she met Tobin, she was just 16 and lived alone.
He was quite charming and quite funny, and just seemed like a genuinely nice bloke. We were getting on quite well and had started seeing each other, and he said, why don't you move in?
Kathy took up his offer in September 1986 and moved into his Brighton flat. Operation Anagram talked to Kathy about their relationship, and they soon discovered that although he had now turned 40, his appetite for cruelty showed no sign of mellowing with age.
I don't know how he does it, but he knows. He must have something written on my head, and all these other women that he has hurt must have it as well. He must see something that other people don't see. But even though I appear very strong and confident now, there's like a little child inside, you know, looking for someone to look after them and care for them, and that's what he provides. That's what he provides. And he knows it, and how he finds them, I don't know, but he knows it.
After just a few months, Kathy was totally controlled by Tobin. Even before she gave birth to their son Daniel, in December 1987, he had started to hit her. Soon after Daniel's birth, they got married. At the time, they were living in one small rented flat after another, and Tobin was out of work. Almost a year after getting married, he conned Kathy into moving up to Bathgate in Scotland with the promise of a better life in a 3-bedroomed house with a garden for their son to play in. But as soon as they arrived there in 1988, his attacks became more frequent and vicious. They were now a daily feature of their life together.
From my point of view, I've gone through so many atrocities when I was a child, but actually, someone throwing you up against a wall and putting their hammer around your neck and calling you horrible names isn't that bad. Bizarrely, it's not. So, I part with things that you wouldn't normally part with, and justify them. You know, say he's tired or You know, he's had a bad day or something. You justify an awful lot of things when it's not as awful as other people might perceive it to be. I really think I was just a possession, and I think the anger from him was that the possession was not conforming the way it was meant to conform. That's all it was. I don't think there was any love there at all. He probably loved his son, I think.
Just as before with his previous wives, Tobin's mental cruelty and physical violence were intended to break Kathy, but she had seen it all before and wanted a different life for her son.
I'd said to him that I was going to leave and and we would get divorced. And he then said to me that if I was to leave him in any shape or form, he'd kill, firstly, my son and make me watch him do it, secondly, me, and then afterwards himself. And from that minute onwards, for the following 3 months, he did not let me out of his sight for a minute.
One day in 1990, Tobin left the house. Kathy finally escaped with Daniel, taking him first to Glasgow and then on to Portsmouth.
You can imagine what sitting in the coach station for 2.5 hours was like. Absolutely frightening, because I knew that I would absolutely not be alive if he found me there. But thankfully I got on a coach, that was good. So I arrived in Portsmouth at 6:30 in the morning at my grandparents' house. That was the first time I'd been back there since obviously I'd left when I was 16.
Kathy didn't know her dad when she was growing up, and despite Tobin's cruelty to her, she didn't want this for Daniel. Tobin doted on his son, he wanted to see him. But even for him, an 8-hour commute from Bathgate to Portsmouth was too much. So in May 1991, he moved to the now infamous house in Margate. He only stayed a few months before he took a flat in Havant, just a couple of miles from where Daniel lived. Tobin never raised a hand to Daniel, so Kathy felt their son would be safe with his father. Tobin used this to gain regular access to his son, and Daniel often stayed overnight. It gave Tobin the perfect excuse to have young women round to babysit. His normal routine was to leave the babysitters with Daniel and then go out for the night. But on the evening of August the 4th, 1993, Tobin carefully planned a vicious trap for 2 young girls. He tried to turn on the charm to seduce the 2 teenagers. When this failed, he plied them with alcohol, and finally he drugged them. As it started to take effect, he began his horrendous assault. In the middle of the night, Tobin telephoned Kathy to come to collect Daniel, telling her that he was feeling seriously unwell with heart trouble. When she arrived, Tobin was coming out of the door with Daniel.
So I took Daniel from him at the front door and I said, do you want me to wait for the ambulance to arrive? You know, you okay? So no, I don't feel quite so bad now, but still take him because I think I will go and have a check-up. I put my son in the car and we came home, went to bed.
With Daniel finally out of the way, Tobin toyed with the girls. He threatened them with a knife, and as the drink and drugs overwhelmed the girls, they could no longer defend themselves. He brutally raped and sodomized them. Then, as they lay unconscious, he turned on the gas taps and left them for dead.
I have no doubt that he expected those 2 girls to die, and the fact that they didn't was an accident.
The next morning I took my son to school, went to work, and then had a phone call at 9:30 from the police. And they said, you need to get your son out of school and we need you to come to the police station and see us and bring someone with you. So that's what I did. And I arrived at the police station and they told me what atrocities had gone on the night before in the flat. And that was the first I heard.
In fact, 5-year-old Daniel had been witness to part of the brutal attacks of the previous night.
At one point, where Peter had stabbed one of the girls and there was blood, he asked Daniel to go and get ice from the freezer and bring it through to him and put it onto the girl.
Tobin left Portsmouth and hid for several weeks, some of them with a religious sect.
So far, police have no positive leads in their search for Mr. Tobin. They're keeping a check on addresses in the Midlothian area of Scotland where he used to live. Yesterday, they took the unusual step of naming Mr. Tobin as the man they want to question in connection with the alleged attacks.
The constantly mobile Tobin had been hiding in Coventry, but returned to the south coast, where he was eventually captured when his blue Austin Metro car was found in Brighton. After a plea bargain, he pleaded guilty to the charge of rape. The attempted murder charge was dropped. At the trial in Winchester Crown Court on the 18th of May 1994, Tobin was sentenced to 14 years. The trial judge was Sir Ronald Waterhouse.
It was, I think, the worst case of its kind that I had during the 18 years I sat as a judge. The age of the victims, the fact that they were drugged and given alcohol, and then there was the evidence that he'd played with them, in effect, a sort of cat and mouse game, and threatened them with a knife.
For the next 10 years, the public would be safe. But in 2004, Tobin was released, Now a registered sex offender, he had to tell the police where he was. Had the longest of his many spells in prison worked? Had Tobin finally learnt his lesson? Or was he simply about to carry on as he had left off, targeting young, vulnerable women to satisfy his psychopathic mind? In 2004, Peter Tobin was 58 years old. He'd been released from prison and had nowhere else to go. He was divorced from his wife, Kathy. His family wanted nothing more to do with him, and his sister was telling people he was dead. Tobin returned to where he grew up, Paisley. There he met another young, vulnerable woman.
One day I seen him, he looked quite ill to me, and he told me that he had a bad heart, and he had angina in that as well, and he ended up going up to the hospital, and I felt kind of sorry for him because he had no one else. The relationship kind of picked up from there. I would go into his house, his wee flat, or he would come upstairs and visit me.
Tobin attempted to lure Debbie into his circle, just as he had done many times before with other young women. But thankfully, the authorities heard about the friendship and warned Debbie about Tobin. They told her he was a rapist. She couldn't believe it and confronted him.
And he said that it was so untrue and that it was going to seek legal advice for that malicious gossip going about. And he wasn't happy when I said to him. And I believed him. And they came back to me again like, Peter has been in the jail for rape.
I've interviewed people who can't believe that Harold Shipman, our Britain's most prolific serial killer, was just that. They think of him still as their most trusted GP. And I've got no doubt that there will be some people who react to Peter Tobin, the fact that Peter Tobin is a serial killer, by saying, but this is the guy who lived next door to me. This is the guy that I used to trust.
I just thought, I got to know a monster. But I couldn't turn around and say, I got to know a monster, I got to know Peter Tobin. But I never knew anything about his dark side because as far as I knew, there was no dark side to him.
Tobin and Debbie's friendship cooled. He found himself a new flat, where in 2005 he began to groom another young woman.
When I seen Peter Tobin round about the town, and I speak to him all the time, he asked me to go for a pint one day and I went for a pint. Then I was continually talking to him. And then one day he says, "Do you want to come round to my flat for a coffee?" I went round and it was a Saturday because the football results were on, and then I was got up to leave and he jumped at my throat with a knife and told me to lie down.
Cheryl McLaughlin had been in the army and was brought up with 8 boys. She was used to fighting her corner.
I managed to get the knife off him, and then I cut my horn open, and then I ran to the door to try and get it, and the keys fell out. And then I turned around and he was chasing me down the hall again with it. So I managed to shout and scream, "Get knife down, get knife down." They threw it in the kitchen sink, and then in the living room, kid was taking a heart attack.
He tries to turn the tables. Rather than us give our sympathy to the woman he's attempted to rape, Tobin wants sympathy for himself. He feigns a heart attack. This is merely just another example of his psychopathic personality.
But I was freaking out this time, but no showing it. And then he's kidding was taking a heart attack, saying he was kidding one. I says, "Well, don't kid one again. Calm down, open the door and get a bit of fresh air." And then he'd let us out and that boat ran like Forrest Gump.
And so did Tobin. Cheryl was taken to hospital. The authorities were informed.
And then the police came to a statement, and then I get told they kicked his door in the next day and they had gone.
Operation Anagram, the police unit devoted to uncovering Tobin's criminal past, has since attempted to piece together Tobin's movements as he evaded the police after the attack in 2005. They know that over the next few months he stayed in a number of hostels. 7 months after the attack on Cheryl, Tobin was now calling himself Pat McLaughlin and began working as a handyman in St Patrick's Church. The place which was the scene of the murder that at long last brought him to the nation's attention and where Operation Anagram would begin their difficult investigation. It was here that he murdered and raped Angelica Kluck, hiding her dead body underneath the church floor. Tobin claimed he was innocent when he was arrested and charged with murder. It was going to need strong forensic evidence to get a conviction. He was still wearing some of the same clothes.
On his watch we found microscopic traces of blood associated with the strap and the sort of grooves and crevices in the strap, and that blood matched the profile of Angelica Kluck. Also, he had on a white t-shirt which was stained at the front, and that was his semen, and a lot of cells matching Angelica Kluck.
According to Tobin's police record, it was only in 1993 that he was first convicted of a violent sexual crime. This left huge gaps in Tobin's life, years in which Tobin may have literally got away with murder after murder across the UK. Operation Anagram now had to look at missing persons cases, cases which could be linked to his movements. It wouldn't be long before they would link Tobin with one of Scotland's most famous and longest-running missing persons cases. In February 1991, a bright, vivacious teenager from Falkirk disappeared on her way home from her sister's house in Livingston. Vicky Hamilton had to change buses in Bathgate to get home to her mother's. She was last seen in the town eating fish and chips and waiting for a bus home. Vicky's disappearance triggered Scotland's biggest ever search for a missing person. Lothian and Borders Police interviewed nearly 7,000 people and took over 3,000 statements. A massive search in and around Bathgate involving hundreds of people revealed nothing. Vicky's mum recorded an emotional plea.
Please get in contact. Let the police know that she's safe. That's all I want, just to know that she's safe.
It wasn't until nearly 17 years later that the mystery surrounding Vicky's disappearance started to unfold. As the police built their case against Tobin for the murder of Angelica Cluck, Operation Anagram made a shocking discovery that Tobin and Vicky could have been in the same town on the same night.
One of the officers went out in an inquiry and we established that Peter Tobin resided in Robertson Avenue in Bathgate, which was close to where Vicky Hamilton was last seen.
And to have someone of that character living in your area is obviously worthy of further investigation.
A forensic search of the house revealed a knife hidden in the loft.
Discovered on the knife was a piece of material which was thought to be skin and yielded a DNA profile which matched perfectly the profile of Vicky Hamilton.
Lothian and Borders Police knew Vicky had been in Tobin's house and that he had probably murdered her, but they didn't have a body. Already in custody for the murder of Angelica, Tobin was then charged with Vicky's abduction. There was not enough evidence for a murder charge. What they needed was a confession.
We seemed to be in control most of the time. However, he declined to speak about Vicky Hamilton other than to deny any knowledge of her.
Sorry, I can't help you. You know what I mean? As I say, I've never met her. You know what I mean? I've never.
While the police in Scotland had been following up the leads in the Vicky Hamilton case from the Operation Anagram, Essex police force 400 miles away had been trying to find another missing girl. 6 months after Vicky had disappeared in 1991, 18-year-old Dinah McNichol went missing. Dinah had just finished her A-levels. To celebrate, she'd gone to a music festival in Hampshire. She was last seen by a friend she had met at the festival as they went their separate ways after hitchhiking up to the M25. Another nationwide search was launched. Where was Dinah McNichol? There were only a few clues. Her friend had seen her drive off with a man he thought had a Scottish accent. The following January, the police searched common land near the festival site.
With Dinah missing for more than 5 months, police fear she's either dead or has been persuaded to join a religious sect and is being held against her will.
Dinah's father, Ian McNichol, had joined the search in the hope that it would bring an end to the nightmare.
Not knowing is terrible. It's been crucifying.
It was 14 years before a breakthrough came, when Operation Anagram provided Essex police with a brand new lead.
This was still a whodunit for us, so Tobin, whilst on the radar, it wasn't until we really analysed a lot of the data that Strathclyde in particular had, then he really came up the scale and became somebody of primary interest to us investigating Dinah's disappearance.
He rose even higher on that scale when Essex police studied the use of Dinah's credit card in several towns along the south coast.
We were able to show that Tobin had links to areas very close to each of these cash machines, either friends or previous residents or places of work. So that was all part of the formula that led us down to Margate in the first place, really.
Essex police then interviewed Tobin's neighbours in Margate.
I saw him digging a deep hole, and I leaned over the fence, which was a lot shorter at that time, and I said, "Are you going for Australia, Pete?" Because it seemed quite big. And he told me he was bigger than digging a sandpit for the little one at the weekends.
Peter Tobin, we now know, was somebody who was profiled as somebody who could well have committed this type of offence. We could show through the analytical work that he probably had opportunity, and I think what we knew from Angelina Cluck investigation was that he had a propensity to bury bodies.
With this knowledge, the police managed to persuade a magistrate to issue a search warrant for 50 Irvine Drive, Margate. It was going to be a deep forensic search. Essex police brought in specialist X-ray equipment from London to see what lay beneath the surface. Forensic archaeologists conducted the excavations.
They knocked on the door and said they'll be doing a little bit of digging in the garden, and where the sandpit was where they found a grave.
The body and the personal effects have been identified as Vicky Hamilton, who went missing in February 1991 from Bathgate in Scotland.
It was a massive shock for Essex police. They had only been looking for Dinah's body. They certainly never thought that Tobin would have driven a dismembered corpse nearly 500 miles to bury Vicky in his back garden. Vicky's body had been cut in two. Tobin then carefully wrapped it in plastic. This helped to preserve some evidence, so when the autopsy was carried out, they found that Vicky had been drugged and then strangled.
The injuries on her chest suggested blunt force had been applied over this area, as would happen, for example, if somebody is kneeling on the body while the process of throttling, strangulation is taking place.
Vicky had gone missing just 7 weeks before Tobin had moved the 492 miles from Bathgate to Margate. The discovery of Vicky's body convinced Essex police they were looking in the right place.
It was quite late in the search that we found Dinah in terms of the back garden. It was one of the last parts we got to. There has been a significant discovery within the last couple of hours here at 50 Irving Drive. There has been another body discovered.
The body was quickly confirmed as Dinah's. It had been wrapped in a number of plastic bags. The 16-year search had finally come to an end, but police then had to sift through the evidence as they prepared to charge Tobin.
The pathology was that there was no natural cause of death, but there was no unnatural cause established. That was partly because she'd been buried for 16 years. There was a large quantity of bags that Dinah had been placed in, something of the order of, I think it was around 20 bags in all. On some of the inner bags, we found Tobin's fingerprints. We found within her body levels of a drug that we know was prescribed to Peter Tobin at the time, amitriptyline. And this, on somebody who doesn't need it, can have stupefying effects. So clearly, I think that is relevant to the mechanism of Dinah's death.
At least they have found our remains, and I can speak for the whole family that we can now put her to rest and grieve in our own time.
Tobin was already serving a 21-year sentence in Scotland's notorious Peterhead prison for the murder of Angelica Crook. After their search of his former home in Bathgate, Lothian and Borders police had charged Tobin with Vicky's abduction. The discovery of her body saw the charge changed to murder. Peter Tobin stood trial for Vicky's murder at Dundee High Court on the 3rd of November 2008. After 21 days, a 15-person jury took less than 2.5 hours to find him guilty. Nearly 30 weeks later, he stood trial again, this time at Chelmsford Crown Court in Essex, for the murder of Dinah McNichol. He had held her captive, drugged her, then murdered and buried her in his garden.
This guy is a murderer. He's a convicted murderer. He's a killer. And he has killed some young, innocent women. The indications that we have is a cool, calculated, homicidal serial killer.
Join us after the break when we examine other murders that could have been carried out by Peter Tobin, and we ask the question, is he Britain's worst serial killer? The Specialist Investigation Unit Operation Anagram was set up in 2006 to examine the life of convicted murderer Peter Tobin. Over the following 2 years, Anagram played an important part in bringing Tobin to justice again. Firstly, for the murder of Vicky Hamilton, who Tobin brutally killed in 1991, and then for the murder of student Dinah McNichol, who he murdered only a few months after Vicky. But few believe that Vicky Hamilton was Tobin's first victim. The way he cut up and disposed of the schoolgirl's body indicated a terrifying degree of murderous expertise.
Dismembering a body, even with butchering skills on animals, is no easy task. To do it so slickly is either got lucky first time round, which is not likely, or he may have had some experience of doing it previously.
When Vicky Hamilton is murdered, Peter Tobin is in his 40s. In my experience, as somebody who's worked a great deal with serial offenders, nobody starts killing in their early 40s. By that stage, they've been killing for a long period of time.
With the hunt for Vicky and Dinah finally over, Operation Anagram has now decided to go public with its existence.
Basically what we're doing is we are looking at the life of Peter Tobin since 1955. We're taking Tobin's life, we're breaking it down, we're dissecting it, we're looking at where he's been. We then look at an event or something that's happened in that area. For example, a crime or a missing person. This is the nerve centre. This is where the information, the life of Peter Tobin is held. This is the main part of it, but in every other linked police force, there's similar teams working, and there are some significant gaps, but hopefully your programme will fill these gaps.
Tobin's movements, his use of aliases, his skills as a forger may have kept him out of jail for violent crimes for decades. Now Operation Anagram needs to fill in the holes.
There are significant gaps that we would hope the public can help us with. So it's addresses, and then that is shared with our police forces. That he was in a particular area at the time, someone went missing, that he lived in a particular address, which was a time event, and that is shared with our police forces, and then they link into that. It's a massive investigation. Tens of thousands of people have been interviewed throughout the UK, but every day we're getting more information which comes forward that takes us to other areas we didn't know he was residing.
The investigation has already recovered a disturbingly large selection of jewellery that was found in Tobin's possession. It is all being forensically examined in the hope that the original owners can be traced.
I'm hoping that we find out who else has been a victim of Peter Tobin's, and maybe bring closure for some families.
Seeing the relief, albeit tragic relief, that is given Ian McNichol and his family to be able to locate Dinah, if there's a chance we can bring that same tragic relief to other families, then it's something that the police service should be doing.
It is now a question of just how many young women Peter Tobin has murdered, and crucially, when did he start killing?
I think Peter Tobin has been murdering for decades. I think Peter Tobin is a very, very dangerous man who could be one of our most prolific serial killers.
In the late 60s, 3 women were killed in Glasgow. They became known as the Bible John murders. The story gripped the nation. The first victim was Patricia Docker, who had been dancing at the Barrowlands ballroom. She left with a stranger, and the next morning her body was discovered in a Glasgow lane.
When I arrived at this locus, actually, the body of a young woman was lying facing this way, and her feet were to the wall. And she was actually completely naked. There was one shoe lying near to her feet, and there was also a sanitary towel lying beside her.
Over the next 18 months, another 2 women were murdered, Jemima MacDonald and Helen Puttock. All 3 were menstruating. At the time, Tobin was living in Glasgow with Margaret.
When you have to have your periods every month, that even gave him more of a kick, and it didn't stop him from having any sex. In fact, it even made it better for him. And I must point out at this time that I was not able to buy any protection for the period or anything else.
The Bible John murders quite clearly had a signature in relation to sanitary towels, to tampons. But as time moved on, the other signatures related to Bible John have been lost.
The last of the supposed Bible John murders took place on October the 30th, 1969, the year Tobin took Margaret to Brighton and married her. Although there were only the 3 murders, the search for Bible John continues.
Quite simply, I think that Peter Tobin is Bible John. And therefore, I think his first murder, for a variety of reasons, is the murder of Pat Docker in 1968 in Glasgow. He's killed in the 1960s, in my view. He's killed in the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s, and we know he's killed in the millennium. So Peter Tobin has probably been killing for longer than any other British serial killer. Tobin himself claimed in prison that he had murdered 48 victims.
The truth is, only Peter Tobin knows how many women he's killed, and only Peter Tobin can decide whether to admit his crimes to the world. As a rule, serial killers don't like to discuss their murders, so it may be Tobin takes his secrets to the grave. And whether he is Britain's worst serial killer may never be known.
I can't understand how a person like Peter Tobin, who will be sitting in his prison cell tonight, maybe watching this programme and watching what has been reported. He's a father. He has children of his own. How can he do that to other people's children? Horrific. A man that has no conscience. A man that's a serial killer. A man that cares about no one but himself.
If you have any information on Peter Tobin, please contact your local police station.